Thank you. Yeah, I'm kind of like a bit of a black sheep of the panel, and it's not the first time that I'm put in a session on video art, when in fact what I'm talking about is quite the opposite. But so, well, yeah, that's got its own connection to the in-between, I guess. So this paper is part of a larger project that assesses the status of photochemical film, not video art, in the contemporary moving image practice. And it's been my view for several years now, probably I've been working on this for more years than is healthy, that the cultural in-betweenness of film, in the sense that it's neither current nor completely obsolete, gives it a special status that allows it to speak from a position of marginality. Film's otherness, that I've elsewhere described in the context of the abject, has become an integral part of its visual language. Furthermore, the awkward and time-consuming working practices associated with it have come to symbolize a form of resistance to endless technological progress fueled by corporate agendas and a culture of incessant speed and instantaneity. And here, I guess, I draw on what Thomas Helsezo was saying yesterday about the fact that it's kind of impossible to work with photochemical film now without it being in some way framed as a form of resistance to digital. But as the various commodified forms of retro fetishism make clear, simply working with old materials isn't in itself a radical gesture. We must look towards critical engagements with the medium, creative acts of reinvention. I'll take this off for a second. Creative acts of reinvention and reconceptualization that yoke material awareness with new perceptual and affectual experiences. So in my work today, I've concentrated on how this emerges in single-screen works, developing a new theory of materialist film that incorporates contemporary perspectives on the material world in an era of commodity excess. But in this presentation, I'd like to shift the focus to the field of expanded cinema. So this is the next step of the research for me, so it's kind of a work in progress, as conference papers tend to be. So here, the interacting presence of both the artist and materials is the locus of meaning and a site of multiple in-betweens, a fluid term that seems to refer to a range of divergent practices, from Jean Youngblood's original formulation to recent accounts of digital screen culture. Expanded film has traditionally been employed to describe a projection event within a specific space outside the cinema. In the context of the British Film Action Group, consisting of filmmakers associated with the London Filmmakers Co-op, this meant bringing the materials and mechanics that were usually hidden from view into the perceptual field, so that the film strip, the repetitive chatter of the projector, the projected image, the body of the artist, as well as multiple and overlapping shadows, come together in a theatre of cinematic spectacle. This projection situation as material event, as Malcolm Le Grais describes it, is, to quote Le Grais, the only point of actual material access to the filmic process for the viewer. So whilst in the 1960s and 70s emphasis was placed on how the visibility of the film apparatus within the space led to a process of defamiliarization and anti-illusionism, in the current context, in the works that I'm talking about, the presence of analog equipment represents a particular cultural position that crystallizes in the performative spectacle of obsolescence. And it's this element of spectacle that I'm interested in exploring here. And I'll use 3 examples to demonstrate how the theatrical staging of mechanical excess elicits a form of embodied material awareness and a dispersed gaze. So I'm using 3 examples, but there are many actually that I could use. And I'll refer to 2 other artists at the end of the paper. It's actually quite a burgeoning field of practice, despite the fact that it remains quite obscure to many people, as is the case generally with experimental or avant-garde forms of practice. So there are a few areas of film scholarship that haven't in some way been touched by Tom Gunning's concept of the cinema of attractions, an approach to pre-narrative cinema that rescued it from a primitive framing. The attractions model, and I'm sure I don't need to repeat it for the people in the room, posited that rather than viewing this period as simply a stepping stone to more sophisticated forms of storytelling, it's possible to see it as establishing a celebration of film's visual qualities that goes underground, as Gunning says, with the arrival and subsequent dominance of narrative cinema. This exhibitionist tendency of early cinema is manifested through self-conscious acts of showing, says Gunning, that invite the audience to revel in the magical possibilities of the medium. And Gunning argues that this cinema was a key source of inspiration for the avant-garde, which was also founded on the exploration of film's visual qualities outside the confines of narrative. What's most appealing about Gunning's cinema of attractions is its historical portability, its potential to find applicability well beyond the period of which it speaks. But contemporary uses of the attractions model tend to privilege the spectacle of new technology, predictably homing in on digital special effects, interactivity, immersion, and drawing parallels with the idea of novelty that was so present at the beginning of cinema. And it's true that the digital era certainly lends itself to comparisons with this early cinematic period, when the filmic apparatus and the simplest of cinematic trickery were a source of amazement amongst both makers and spectators. But equally interesting, and far less discussed, is the spectacle of the outmoded, or the novelty of the old reframed as new, and staged through performances that, as Jonathan Whalley has argued, quote, partake of a kind of illusionism and an indulgence in visual pleasure that distinguishes them from many early works of expanded cinema. Emphasising the material presence of bulky analogue equipment and various mechanical paraphernalia, contemporary expanded film performance aims to get under the spectator's skin. It's loud, messy, chaotic, often improvised, and susceptible to failure. It's perceptually overwhelming and physically immersive, but what distinguishes it most of all is the relationship between the presence of the artist as analogue magician and the visual spectacle being played out on the screen in front of the audience. And the artists I discuss playfully foreground this tension, creating a complex viewing situation that hovers somewhere between cinema and theatre. Expanded film practice reflects the exhibitionist cinema of which Gunning speaks by embracing rather than rejecting the medium's relations with theatre. Can we dim the lights and I'll see if I can continue to read this. Greg Pope's Cipher Screen most effectively demonstrates the connection between contemporary expanded work and Sergei Eisenstein's principle of visceral shocks that underpins Gunning's cinema of attractions. Sorry, it's not so great to identify, but maybe when I describe the work it might become a bit clearer what's going on. The work uses two 16mm projectors with black film loops and a live sound feed. As the film moves through the projector and onto a purpose-built operating table, Pope attacks it with a variety of mechanical tools, scratching, cutting, puncturing, and drilling. These interventions are experienced moments later as abstract images on the screen. As the successive layers of physical manipulation build towards a vibrating visual field, the amplified brutality creates a corresponding looping and echoing auditory onslaught, transferring to the body of the spectator the violence inflicted on the film strip. Situated towards the back of the auditorium and hovering at the edge of the spectator's visual field, Pope's presence is central to the effective power of the piece. In her account of Cipher Screen at the Tate Modern in 2014, Catherine Elwes describes the specific constellation of artist as performer, material excess, and visceral impact. So to quote Elwes, the artist looked like a demented goldsmith as he frantically brutalized the film strip, the emulsion dust from the grinding action rising eerily through the projection beam. The banshee screeching increased, the the tension grew as the film rose to a crescendo of crackling sounds and strobing abstractions. Cipher Screen highlights the fundamental paradox at the heart of the film material. The images produced result from the gradual erasure of the emotion from the surface of the film strip. As Pope moves from scalpel to power tools, the excessive nature of the intervention shifts into a space of absurdity, gradually drawing the spectator's attention away from the screen and towards the shadowy figure of the drill-yielding Pope. What's this maniac up to? What's going on? What's the relationship between what I'm seeing, hearing, smelling, and the baffling acts of mechanical labour at the back of the room? So it's really interesting to experience these expanded performances, because you can see people being really immersed in what's going on the screen, and then gradually having this kind of awkward looking to the back of the room to see what's going on, and then there's this schizophrenic movement between the front and the back, between the illusion and the creation of those images. The audience then becomes animated by a feeling of impending doom, impending catastrophe, as the image on the screen starts to fall away and the film eventually snaps. So this is the end of the performance, when the film gives up. And at the heart of the performance is, of course, the willful destruction of celluloid, an act of avant-garde vandalism, to quote Louis Ricoda, that runs through experimental film history, from the letterists and Paul Sharits and Jürgen Reb to numerous contemporary examples of expanded cinema. I'm thinking particularly Temkin in France. And this involves scratching, live scratching, burning, various different forms of intervention. Whilst earlier instances of physical destruction can be linked to the rejection of cinematic illusionism, particularly in the letterist films, and the problems of representation, recent examples seem more directed towards a heightened awareness of film's physicality in a throwaway culture. An abject object, it refuses to disappear. It hangs in a state of liminality and disturbs the capitalist drive to upgrade, discard, and move on. Another notable expanded film performance that draws on the avant-garde tradition via the spectacle is Parallax by the Paris-based collective Nominoué. Using 4 16mm cameras mounted on specially built tracks and a combination of 3 screens, one of them transparent, the trio create a choreographed moving projection event. Parallax refers to a visual phenomenon whereby an object appears differently depending on the position from which it's viewed. And the performance explores various optical effects through the specific positioning and overlapping of the 4 images as they slide across and between different surfaces. In its emphasis on geometry and space, the performance feels like a descendant of the 1920s graphic animation films by Hans Richter, Walter Ruttmann, and Viking Egling. Early examples of intermediality, these paintings in motion, such as Richter's Rhythmus 21 and Rhythmus 23, made in 1921 and 1923 respectively, drew on the temporal nature of film and the ability to construct an illusion of depth on a flat plane, showing simple geometric shapes getting bigger and smaller and appearing to move in and out of the frame. By removing the emotional drama that dominated narrative cinema, Richter claimed to cultivate a distinctly cinematic form of perception and feeling, based on graphic relations, spatial proximity and distance. Nominoué's Parallax cleverly revives these ideas by employing an element of theatricality markedly different to the one rejected by Richter. For if Richter's vision of cinematic expression was one of reduction, Nominoué pursued an aesthetic of expansion by incorporating elaborate bodily gestures into a gradually unfolding kinetic spectacle. So I'm just going to show a short extract. It's quite difficult to find satisfying documentation of these performances because, as you probably imagine, part of the impact of the performance is about this visual and oral overload. So they're quite overwhelming experiences. And each time I watch video documentation of them, I'm disappointed. But this one is not so bad, so I thought I could show a little bit of it. And the resolution isn't so great. It wasn't so bad when I looked at it last night, but here it's not great. So just, yeah, I apologise for that. That gives a very rough idea of what I'm talking about. But what you don't see is the second thing that I'm talking about, which is the filmmakers, the artists themselves, with these specially constructed tracks, and they're constantly moving the projectors around. And uprooting the projector from its traditionally static position is no easy task, given the weight of the machinery and the potential disruption to the projection mechanism. And for this reason, very few expanded cinema performances incorporate mobility into the projection event. But the trio get around this by transposing the technology associated with film production, the tracks on which the cameras move, to the performance space. And in doing so, this space takes on the coordinates of a shooting set, transgressing the boundaries between the normally set distinct and separate phases of cinema production and cinema consumption. Crouched on the ground just below the screen, the three performers sweep backwards and forwards and side to side in a majestic mechanical ballet, or ballet mécanique, to quote the title of Ferrand Léger's 1924 film, 26, which was surely not far from the artist's minds. The intricate geometric compositions registered on the film, lines, cubes, rectangular forms, take on three-dimensional qualities due to the exact spatial positioning of the screens and the projectors, which produces a sense of awe and amazement that's only enhanced by the physical presence of the performers. The eye shifts between stage and screens, attention focused not just on the spectacle of the image, but also its coming into being, as Peter Guedal might describe it. But Peter Guedal contradicts everything that anyone says anyway, so he would probably contradict my reading of his theory. Woven together through the electronic soundscape of sound artist Michaelis Moschoutis, Parallax is a powerful example of how contemporary artists are forging new ways of working with analogue film in a live context. The element of spectacle, revealing and showing, draws on its historical roots, but also forces a contemplation of how old materials can perform their distinct physicality in effective and affective ways. And I'll just move on to my last example. If contemporary expanded cinema is characterised by both material and sensory excess, then a recent performance by 4 female artists from the Filmwerkplaats lab in Rotterdam is the ultimate embodiment of this. First performed at the Rotterdam Film Festival in 2016, it was actually my 40th birthday, the day of my 40th birthday, that I saw this performance, so it felt quite, I felt the weight of it, felt quite appropriate. It's a highly staged, high-octane piece of analogue film magic, accompanied again by a dynamic and immersive electronic soundtrack, this time by Ji-Young Kang. And it's quite interesting that this performance, it's probably the most excessive and physically and sensually, visually overwhelming of all the pieces that I'm discussing. And I used to wonder if there was an element of sort of masculinity in this quite physical, overwhelming form of expanded cinema. And then I realised that actually there are women that are doing work that is as masculine, if you want to call it that. So it's quite a nice comparison with Nomi Noe, which is a group of male artists. This is an all-female group of artists. As with much contemporary expanded film performance, the piece follows an arc of gradually building intensity that reaches a point of full-on visual and auditory spectacle, an adrenaline rush of excess that then tails off into an ending suggesting physical exhaustion or mechanical failure. And in ways similar to Nomi Noe's Parallax, the three performers explore the effects of different spatial positioning, angling the projector beam in such a way that it spreads across the wall. Several projectors placed throughout the performance space overlap and vibrate together, whilst at the centre of the room, a series of modified slide projectors, you don't see it here unfortunately, display images of mechanisms spinning and turning in coloured liquid. The full performance is actually on Vimeo if you do a search for it. It's just that I didn't find it that satisfying to screen. But you can have a look at it to see what I'm talking about. So you have these three projectors that seem to have liquid and have spinning objects inside. And it has these overtones of a mad scientist reveling in some new chemical invention. And the oddly realist quality of these magnified details contrasts with the abstract flickering of the 16mm projection. Although these performers are less on stage than in, say, Parallax, the sudden appearance of a projector here or a light there makes the spectator aware of their nimble movement around the darkened space. And it's this element of surprise that partly characterises the performance based on as it is on sensory overload. So you become really immersed in the images and then realise that a person and a projector has suddenly moved into a completely different position in the space. So as with works by artists, just to name a couple of other people, by Sally Golding and Bruce McClure, sensory excess and perceptual overload is intricately tied to a corresponding material excess, a mechanical bric-a-brac of a frequently hand-built hybrid nature. This is analogue film, literally screaming its presence, grabbing the spectator by the throat. Look at me. But what of this theatrical exhibitionism? An outdated technology in its death throes, replaying the medium specificity debates of the 1960s and 70s, surely? No. As Wally has argued, contemporary, quote, contemporary expanded cinema is not an image of the death of film. It is rather a reflection on the thingness of film in an era of surplus artifacts and ready-made experiences. It nurtures a belief in the importance of material encounters and in the potential of renewal and reinvention outside pre-mapped trajectories. It explores alternative fields, an alternative field of objects and affects for which capitalist techno-normativity and techno-mediocrity has no coordinates. Thank you.